Hello, I'm Chris Grosso, and this is the story behind my stories.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Long,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Chris Grosso.
Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to Author Stories. You can find all of the archives of the show over at hankgarner.com. There are handy links over in the sidebar on the right-hand side where you can subscribe to the show. You can find all of the archives in a handy little drop-down list, or there's a search bar where you can search for your favorite author and see if they have been on the show in these past more than 400 episodes. Thank you to our sponsors for allowing us to do this. And we've got some new sponsors coming on. Daniel Kinney, my favorite middle grade author, is just doing amazing things right now. He is publishing like a madman, but he's putting out excellent books. I buy his books for my nieces and nephews all the time. My kids are a little older now, but my nieces and nephews, I buy Daniel's books and put them in their hands. They are top shelf quality and really fun books. There's a link to Daniel's Amazon page in the show notes, and we're going to be highlighting more of his books as we go on this month. But go visit Daniel Kinney and buy his books for your favorite kids, and they will love it. Roy M. Griffiths has a new book, Bringing the Fire, The Lonesome George Chronicles, Book 2. Roy is really doing some amazing stuff in speculative fiction, and we're going to be highlighting more of those as the month goes on. But go pick up Roy's newest books. There's a link to it in the show notes. If you're a fan of alternative history or war and military thrillers, you're going to love these books. There's a link to it in the show notes. Also, thanks to my buddies Nick and Jason from Galaxy's Edge for sponsoring the show. Thanks for tuning in. As always, at the end of the show, we have an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. He enlisted for the money. He stayed for the girl. Gateway to the Galaxy, the new series everyone is talking about, beginning with Book 1, Into the Breach. Frank and Marine Space Corps 1 find themselves across the galaxy in a WWE smackdown with the legions of a boss-level villain. But the party's just getting started. He donned the mantle of a celestial knight to impress a girl, well, an empress. Now destiny's calling in a debt. A lightning-paced military fantasy full of outlandish comedy and impossible situations that will have you hailing for these Marines from the get-go. For fans of Green Lantern and the Stargate universe. Listen to what some readers are saying. This is good stuff. Thanks for the new obsession. I recommend and can't wait for the next book. And the visual pictures and action are amazing. They're getting the band back together, and this time, it's serious nonsense. Pick up the Gateway to the Galaxy series by Jonathan Yanez and J.R. Castle, available now on Amazon.com. There's a link to it in the show notes. Gateway to the Galaxy. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm super excited to have Chris Grosso on the show with me today. Chris is an author. He's also a podcaster and kind of has his hands in lots of things, which means he's a man after my own heart. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Thank you so much for having me, Hank. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm excited to talk to you, and I love talking to another podcaster because your sound is always amazing. So,
yes, I know, right? It is nice. Same here when I have people on my show that do podcasting or know about interview and the importance of sound quality. So, exactly. I certainly resonate with that.
Exactly. So, Chris, we're going to talk about the podcast and your books and all that good stuff. But before we can do that, we have to answer the first question that we always ask, and that is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or a storyteller?
So, yeah, I love that question. And to be honest, the interesting thing, I'm a very transparent person, so I will tell you up front that I did not set out to be a writer by any means. And part of me, to be totally honest, feels a little guilty at times because I know people that are incredible writers. And I'm also a musician, self-taught writer as well. Never went to school for writing, never took a lesson on guitar, bass, or drums, with the exception of learning how to read music. But with writing, having a book deal literally fell in my lap. And I know, like, poor me, right? But, it's like, so I read people like Bukowski and Thompson and Thoreau, and, there's just all these writers that I would consider a writer. But for myself, it's almost like I consider myself more of an experience sharer, as I just, my craft has certainly grown over the course of writing 3 books.
Sure. But
prior to that, I didn't really set out to be a writer. I honestly wanted to work in some kind of like social work field, always just helping others. And it just so happened I should mention I'm in recovery from drugs and alcohol, and the reason I mention that is I started writing a little bit about my experience and sharing it with some various blogs that accepted unsolicited material, and sincerely just with the hope that maybe someone would read it and avoid many of the pitfalls that I've fell down time and again in my own life. And between that and starting a website, it just kind of snowballed. And next thing I knew, a friend of mine who is a New York Times bestselling author. She's become a friend and mentor, but she had read some of my stuff and really liked it, and said she wanted to introduce me to her literary agent. And honestly, even in that moment, it was still the farthest thing from my radar, actually writing a book and doing this is a living now, this in public speaking. So I know this is a very long-winded answer, but like I said, I'm very honest about really everything in my life. And I will say I would not rather be doing anything other than I'm doing now. I love writing. It means the world to me that I'm able to have these books out there that are helping people, and not just with drug and alcohol addiction, but various just well-being in general. We all have these self-defeating behaviors. So to have that as an extension of the other work I do, which is leading workshops and speaking at conferences or festivals, I'm just utterly humbled by it. So all that to say, I don't specifically have a first memory. And honestly, the last thing I'll say is I didn't really start enjoying reading until I was about 24 years old. But now I love reading more than anything. I have the word bookworm tattooed across my knuckles. My apartment got broken into many years ago when I went down to Florida. My parents live in Connecticut, where my apartment was. They told me, and the first thing I asked them, I didn't ask about my guitar equipment. I didn't ask about my electronics. I said, "Are the books okay?" And of course they were. Nobody's going to take my books. So even though it was a heartbreaker to lose some really lovely guitars, my books were intact. So.
I actually love that answer. And I always give that caveat. When did you want to become a writer or a storyteller? Because I believe that certain people, and this is my pet theory, and I know people are sick of hearing it, but my pet theory is that people are born storytellers. And writing may or may not come out of that. You may take that storytelling gift, that gene, however you want to classify it.
Sure.
You may take that and make a career out of it, or you may take that and entertain your family with it, or you may take that and use it to connect with other people to share a message of hope, or whatever expression that comes out of. Sometimes you can make a living with it. Sometimes you don't. Whether someone pays you to do it or not, really has no great effect on whether you have the gift or not.
100%. And even, conversely to that, me being paid to write, I feel like I was saying earlier, there are so many writers that I would love to see being paid to write, but aren't, and same with musicians. There's so many mind-blowingly talented musicians out there that are living that starving artist life. And I'll be clear, just because I have 3 books published with traditional publishers, I I am between that and speaking and doing workshops. That is my living, but I live paycheck to paycheck. I live in a very modest apartment with my girlfriend. I drive a decent car, but I am by no means rich. This is not a very lucrative career unless you are one of those lucky, J.K. Rowlings, or more in my field, like who's big right now? Eckhart Tolle's, people of that nature. But that's writers. The majority of them, at least the ones I've met, they don't do it for the money. They do it because it's a call within them. It's something you can't ignore, and I know that's the case with myself. So just like people that get into my other line of work, which is service and helping others in their difficult times in life, that also is not a lucrative career. But people don't embark on that to make money. It's because it's what their heart is pulling them towards. So.
Well, Chris, in talking to more than 400 authors on the show,
I saw that.
Yeah, it's nuts. I can't even wrap my head around it sometimes. But thank you. But talking to this many people, when you talk to someone who has found an outlet for their gift, more than not, the response is one of humility. And that the writer is humbled that he or she has found a way to share their gift with others, to answer the calling, that you get paid to do this. It's a very humbling thing, and the great egotist is the rare exception I've found.
Yes. Oh yeah. So well said. And I have the pleasure of speaking with a lot of New York Times bestselling authors or award-winning authors. I am neither of those things, but I'm very fortunate to, share company with them a lot of times when I go and travel and speak, and that is absolutely the case. People really are humbled by it, and humbled by the fact that this is how they're able to make a living, and it's not an easy, way to make a living. It's very, very strenuous at times, but makes me think of not even a month ago, my girlfriend said to me just kind of haphazardly, if you could do anything, or if you could be anything, what would you be, or what would you do with your life? And without hesitation, I was able to answer her completely honestly that I'm doing it right now, and I know a lot of people can't say that. And that fact, there's not a day that goes by that is not lost on me. I'm so fortunate to be able to do this and to be able to give back and really help people in their healing journeys while continuing to work on mine, every single day. It's a lifelong thing. But anyways, yeah, it's really wonderful to see that people's hearts are so involved in this. And I think it's a kind of a prerequisite, because when it's not, at least to me, it shines forth so glaringly. It's so obvious to see if someone is writing and trying to do something catchy and make money off of it. And I don't mean to sound judgmental or anything, but it loses its authenticity to me. I don't feel like a heart resonance with it. So, but that's just my 2 cents. If that's me.
Well, it sounds to me, Chris, that a lot of the work that you're doing, the writing that you're doing, the service work that you do, the workshops that you do, a lot of the stuff that you're doing is born out of some of your very personal experience, and the titles of your books seem to reflect that. Your newest book is called Dead Set on Living, making the difficult but beautiful journey from effing up to waking up. And then your one of your other books is called Indy Spiritualist, the no bullshit exploration of spirituality. Tell us a little bit, if you don't mind, about the journey that got you to the place where you felt like you had some story to share.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, like I said earlier, I am in recovery from drug and alcohol addiction, along with I've struggled with eating and my weight and mental health, things like depression and bipolar. So that started for me, the depression aspect and self-cutting and suicide attempts. I've kind of been through the ringer, and on more than one occasion. I've been to detoxes, emergency rooms, jail cells, rehabs, psychiatric hospitals, psych wards, all sorts of ugliness in my life. And there's nothing terminally unique in that. I've met so many other people who have been through similar, if not worse, than I have. And many people, sad to say, haven't made it. I've lost a lot of friends and just loved ones, unfortunately, to whether it was substance related or mental health issues. But so, I guess I actually started experimenting with drugs and alcohol a bit later than most people I went to school with. They started more around 13, 14. I started closer to 16. But I made up very quickly for lost time, and I kind of went through those stages of experimentation into regular use, then to abuse, and then I crossed that line from abuse to addiction around the age of 19. And from 19 to 24, my life was just this pretty rough downward spiral. I was still what you could consider a functioning addict, in the sense that I was playing in bands, I had a job, I was going to school, but it just was continually getting worse, and I began missing work, and I dropped out of school. I was blackout drinking and don't remember performing certain shows, and I ended up in my first detox at 24, went into a rehab program, and actually got sober for about 14 months, and then experienced another relapse. I was on vacation in Rome and took that saying when in Rome a little bit too literally, and that started another downward spiral, and that became kind of the course of the next several years of my life, where I would get clean and sober, usually anywhere from 9 months to over a year. I had a couple years, I had even 5 years at one point of sobriety, and but in between those, I would stop doing what I needed to do to take care of myself, which is a number of different things. It's not just meetings, but I also, exercise is very important for me, and meditation, skateboarding, playing music. These are all part of my recovery. And I never tell anyone, what they should do, because we're all unique individuals. So, what I do for my own well-being might not work for somebody else. And that's why in my writing, it's so important to present all of these different paths and practices, some traditional, some non-traditional, just so I can give readers as wide of a view of different healing modalities as possible. But kind of coming back to my story, this last book, Dead Set on Living, picks up. It was over 2 years ago, and I was married at the time, and the marriage was pretty rocky, and I experienced a relapse there, and that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak, in regards to the marriage. And it was this was a 24-hour relapse that started with Percocets I was prescribed for a root canal, and it ended up with me drinking, and literally over the course of 24 hours, I ended up in a hospital, intubated, because I was no longer breathing on my own at this point. I blew. Goodness. Yeah, it was pretty bad. I blew like a 0.49, I think. That was my blood alcohol content level.
Whoa.
And for those who aren't familiar, really like a 0.3 or above for a lot of people could equal death. So, I'm getting close to a 0.5, and so yeah, they had a tube in my lungs breathing for me. They had a second tube in my stomach that was trying to soak up some of the alcohol, and since I was incoherent, they didn't know what else was in my system. They gave me Narcan, which is it's like a quick shot that, in case you've overdosed on heroin, usually brings someone back. I was not doing any kind of heroin or anything like that, but they didn't know that, so they were just taking all the precautions they could. And I was very, very lucky to make it through that experience. It was to the point where they told me, the doctor said, if you were here pretty much even 5 minutes after you came in, even if you survived, you would have been brain dead, because I was no longer breathing when I got to the hospital. That's why they had to intubate me. And, I just from that lack of oxygen going to my brain, it could have been a lot worse than it was. It was not an easy road back from that, but I'm fully healthy today. I go out running again. I'm living a pretty healthy lifestyle, being of service, speaking, traveling, doing workshops. So, obviously that's a very condensed version. I just covered, about 25 years in a few minutes, but
Right.
that's kind of some of the main points. So,
Right.
yeah.
Well, your first book was called Indy Spiritualist.
Yeah.
We mentioned it earlier, and your website is I think it's indyspiritualist.com, isn't it?
Yeah,
The indyspiritualist.com.
Yeah.
What does that title, that moniker, that descriptor? What is an Indy Spiritualist, and what does that mean to you?
Yeah, so the funny thing about that is, in the beginning, it meant nothing, aside from the fact that, so this is before I was really writing much, but I wanted to start a website, or first of all, I was looking for a website that covered a lot of the things I was interested in. I have a very eclectic enjoyment in all things, from music to movies to art to literature. I'm just very diverse, and so I was looking for a web page, or actually it started out trying to find a magazine and then a website, something that covered things like spirituality, but also independent or alternative cultures, and I couldn't find it any. 2010, so about 8 years ago. And that's not saying there wasn't anything, but I didn't find anything then, personally. So I was driving to work one day. I was working at a elementary school. I was a assistant site director for a before and after school program with kids grades kindergarten to 5th grade. And it was about a 35-minute commute. And I was just driving in one morning, and the words Indy Spiritualist popped into my head. And it rang out like as a real truth for me, because again, independent culture is something I'm very passionate about, as is spirituality. So Indy Spiritualist, there you go. I named the site that, and it started out as more of an interview website where I would interview bands that I liked, or directors, spiritual teachers. So I was very, very lucky to start interviewing people like George Romero, who did the Living Dead movies, or Dawn of the Dead, Night of the Living Dead. Danny Trejo is an incredible actor. He's been, a number of movies. And then a lot of different musicians like Amy Mann or Chino from Deftones. A lot of really well-known hip-hop artists I love. Henry Rollins. Just all sorts of really cool people. And then spiritual teachers that meant a lot to me. People like Ram Dass and Ken Wilber, and I'm trying to think who else is a little more mainstream. I'm not super mainstream in my interests, so some of these names might be a little abstract for some people listening. But for me, they were people that have really impacted my life. And from there, that was around the time, or actually I should say shortly thereafter, I started writing a little bit more. Instead of doing just interviews, I started writing more about my own experience with addiction and recovery. And that was where I started writing for those websites, like I mentioned earlier, that accepted unsolicited material. Shortly after that, the first book, Indy Spirituals, came out. And it was at that point where I was like, well, if we're going to name the book that, because originally my publisher shopped it with the title Watch It Burn, which that's what I wanted to name it. But the publishers weren't really feeling that for a quote unquote kind of spiritual book. And, anyone who writes knows you've got to pick and choose your battles if you're working with a traditional publisher. So, Indy Spiritualist was already somewhat of a brand at that point. And I said, all right, that's fine. We'll go with that. But, so I'm like, well, all right. So what is an Indy Spiritualist? And, so what I did was I really went back and I looked at all of the emails, or just the general correspondence I would get based on the website and the articles that I had been writing up to that point. And really, I guess upon looking at that, it's when I realized that, for me at least, what an Indy Spiritualist is, and it's still completely open to interpretation, but my interpretation is that it's easily enough just someone who honors their heart's calling and the truth within themselves. So it has nothing to do with an aesthetic look, but really just insides. So a lot of people look at me and I am very heavily covered in tattoos. Like 80% of my body is covered, and I have big stretched out earlobes. And, I've been doing that for over 20 years now. And so they kind of associate Indy Spiritualists with, this kind of punk rock alternative culture. And to a certain extent, sure, it is, because that's a big part of my life. But it could be somebody who, wears a suit and tie to work and works on Wall Street. It's not about outsides. It's really about just honoring our calling and along with that, going deeper and seeing what else is beneath the surface, getting in touch with who we are and what really does resonate for us in life, and having that. I use the word spiritual, but I don't care what other people use. I just use it because it's English language, and we have to use words. So to me, spirituality fits. But to me, that's a spiritual connection when we get more in touch with ourselves and what's inside. And the second step is, once we connect to that, really embracing it and allowing that to kind of flourish through us in our writing, and whatever else we do in life, in our work, in our relationships, and whatever. So, yeah, I guess that's what an Indy Spiritualist is and kind of how it came to be. But again, open interpretation. Anyone's answer about that is, to me, just as equally valuable and correct.
You've mentioned a couple of times, Chris, that your spiritual pursuit, for lack of a better word, because we have to use words,
right.
and writing. Do you consider writing to be a spiritual pursuit? I can't even think of the word I want to use, but is this a meditative thing for you when you write?
Yeah, it's 100% for me spiritual. Meditative, not so much all of the time, because there are times where I want to throw my computer through the window.
Right.
Thank goodness, though, being a musician before being a writer, I learned the hard way, and after many broken guitars, that I can't force myself to write something. I need to let it flow through me. Right. And, so I started to try to force writing as well, and it was just the same experience I'd have with trying to write a song on guitar. If I'm not feeling it, if it's not flowing effortlessly, then for me it's not going to happen. And now again, like, I know there are other writers, and most writers more than not would say you should write every day, and I completely honor that, but for me that doesn't work. I can only write when I feel like that flow and I feel called to. I know this is borderline blasphemy, especially for the show, but I honestly, I haven't written a single thing since I finished Dead Set on Living, which was probably, we finished the editorial rounds about 8 months ago. I have not written one thing. I've been playing my guitar, I've been leading workshops, I've been traveling, doing interviews, doing podcasts, but I have not felt called to sit down and write. That book really took it out of me. I mean, it was only my third book. It was definitely the biggest endeavor I've ever taken on. But just last week on my show, I had the author Mark Nepo, who is a New York Times bestselling author, very highly celebrated writer. He's absolutely incredible. This guy has over 20 books out, and I mean, they are incredible books, every one of them. And he's toured with Oprah on her Live the Life You Want tour and been on her show a number of times. I mean, this is a big-time, amazing writer. And I said to him, I'm like, Mark, I finished my third book last year, and I'm sure at some point I'll write a fourth, but I don't know when. And and he has his new book, 21st or 22nd book coming out just came out this month, and he just kind of laughed, and he's like, yeah, it's different for everybody. Some people, it just flows quickly or more easily, and others it doesn't. And then I found out from his publicist, who I've become friends with, he's working on like 2 other books right now on top of this new one. And I don't know how he does it and how other people do it. But anyways, I know I'm kind of trailing off from your question, but to get back to me, anytime I read something that makes me feel, whether it's, quote unquote spiritual or not. So for example, like Bukowski, his work to me can be very visceral, and I love that. It is very raw and ragged, and it makes me feel when I read it. So to me, that is a very spiritual experience with a book. Mark Danielewski's book, what was it, House of Leaves. I absolutely loved that book because it was just scary and weird and intriguing. And Neil Gaiman's stuff, I mean, that stuff to me, you wouldn't find it in the spirituality section of a bookstore, but I find it so spiritual. Chuck Klosterman is another great writer whom I absolutely adore. And these are people, again, just you're not your typical or usually thought of as spiritual writers, but from my lens, at least, that's how I view it because they make me feel when I read their work. So, and same with music, when it makes me feel something, that is a very what I would call spiritual experience, and often meditative as well. But when I'm writing, when I'm at the helm, like I said, it can be meditative when I'm in the flow. But oftentimes, I start to feel a little stressed or experience some writer's block, and that's definitely not a meditative feeling. But that's when I've learned, just set it aside and come back when you feel ready to.
Well, and I'm with you that I understand that creating good habits, and if you're going to be a writer, writing every day is definitely creating a good habit. And especially if you're working on a series and you have people that are waiting for your next release, then you probably need to be writing. And honoring those commitments.
Yes.
But I'm also a big believer in that the art of writing is a very deep, personal, and very draining exercise. And if a writer is going to continue to go to the well and to go deep, you have to stop and recharge your batteries. You have to, you just can't keep putting out without taking some in. So I'm a big proponent of taking some time off and interacting with humans for a while so that you can come back and tell more stories about the human condition.
Oh, that's so well said. I'm so glad you said that because I couldn't relate to that more. I mean, aside from my own experiences with addiction and substance abuse and how that is, just like you said, so draining when you write. I mean, writing, no matter what, is, for me at least, and a lot of people I've talked to that are writers, a very draining, albeit cathartic, but also draining experience. And in my case, as I'm writing, I'm reliving a lot of the ugliness of my past. And it's not just about, the dark times, but I will often reference those, but as kind of a foundation of, but here's how, I healed from that, or here's a tool or a technique or, something that hopefully will be of benefit to the reader so they live a more peaceful and joyous life. But I am still reliving that emotional experience, and that is so draining. And on top of that, I am a very introverted person. So it's very strange. Like, I can go talk in front of 2,000 people and be fine, but you put me in a somewhat a smaller gathering, something a little more intimate, and it's like I close up. And it's funny, if I'll be out at a party with my girlfriend and there's not a lot of people there, she'll often give me a little hug and just whisper in my ear, like, "You're doing great," a little encouragement, because she knows it's not easy for me. So you put those two things together, and it's a really draining experience. And I think that's just why I haven't felt moved to sit back down and write anything. I've certainly had some ideas, and there are some things I'm toying with because I can feel that it's starting to come back. But like I said, I'm not going to force it. However, I also appreciate you said, some people have deadlines, and in my field, I don't. So if you have a deadline, obviously, of course, honor that. I remember I shared that similar my writing style. I was speaking in my old high school a couple of years ago, and after I did a full assembly, and I just kind of gave a talk to the whole school, and then after that, I went in and visited some of the creating writive classes, and one of them, they asked me kind of what my writing habits were, and I shared just that. And how I didn't write every day. And I remember the look of horror on the teacher's face because I was saying, I never force myself to write if I'm not feeling it. And then I saw her face, and I quickly caveated that by saying, that is, though, I don't, because I don't have a specific deadline. Or if I do have a deadline, I'll honor that. If you guys have homework, you must do your homework. This is not an out for you not to do your homework. Or if you have an assignment that's due, make sure it's due on time. And because when I am writing, I'm the kind of writer where I will be ahead of deadline. I'm never late. I don't procrastinate. I don't like that feeling of having that looming over my head. But yeah. So anyways, I just like you said, I'm taking some time to have that human connection and just fill up my own cup, so to speak, so I can dive back in, I'm sure sooner than later, and start working on something else.
I really want to get into how the newest book, Dead Set on Living, came about. You mentioned earlier some of the personal things you were going through and some of the devastation you were living through. What was inspiration for that book? And I want to get to that in just a minute. But first, tell us about the podcast. And was that an outgrowth of the blogging you were already doing? And this is a question I'm really interested in, because how do you feel like the podcast and the other blogging you do affect your creative process, and do you feel like they bleed over into the writing that you do?
Yeah, that's awesome. So let's see. As far as the podcast goes, prior to doing that, I had been doing interviews, like I said, for the website. And
you've got some amazing ones on there. Henry Rollins, Christian Hosoi, just a couple that kind of heroes of mine. You've had some really amazing stuff.
Thanks. Yeah, and that was awesome. Like Ian MacKay from Fugazi was on there, and the cool thing is, like, a lot of those interviews I referenced in the first book, because I love interviewing and podcasting because I learn so much, and even being on shows with you, I've already learned a bunch of stuff from you, Hank, and I love that. And I consider myself a student of life, and that's why I'm so fascinated with doing this sort of stuff. As far back as high school, I was doing a zine, and I remember being fortunate in like 10th or 11th grade to interview the drummer of Rage Against the Machine. So this is going back to it was like 1994, I think. So I'm dating myself here, but it's just always been a passion. I've just always been a very curious person. So the podcast came about. I wasn't really doing much in the way of interviewing. I was doing more writing and working on my first book. And as I mentioned earlier, I think I mentioned the name Ram Dass, who is one of the great spiritual teachers of my life, and a very, very highly celebrated individual for those who have interest in spirituality, even those who don't. I mean, that show Lost, which I absolutely loved, one of the characters' names was Richard Alpert, who is based on Ram Dass. That's his real name, and he's just been referenced in a lot of pop culture. I remember one of my favorite shows, 6 Feet Under, he's mentioned in that, and Netflix just did a little documentary on him. But anyways, they were starting his foundation called Love Serve Remember was starting a networking, a podcast network. And the gentleman who heads the foundation, he's the executive director, is the one who's in charge of the podcast network. And he reached out to me and he said, why don't you have a podcast? And I said, well, because he knew I'd done interviews. And I'm like, I don't know. I've been focusing on writing more, etc. And he's like, well, we'd love to have you do a show on the network if you'd like. And he told me some of the other people who had shows on there. And these are some of the great, great teachers in my life. Like Ram Dass has a show on there, and a wonderful Buddhist teacher, Sharon Salzberg, is on there, and kirtan musician Krishna Das, and Joseph Goldstein. Just all of these really wonderful, just amazing people. And so it's still hard for me to wrap my head around the fact that I'm now over 2 years with this network family of podcasters that are my teachers. So that's kind of how the podcasting came to be. The difference between that and the writing, of course, it definitely bleeds over, like you mentioned, because a lot of times in those conversations, something will really stick out to me, and then even though I don't know it at the time, I'll be writing, or that'll be the basis of maybe something I start to write, or just an idea or seeds planted in my head that later comes back up, and I start writing about it But then again, one other difference before I talk a little bit, or we get into the new book, the difference with the podcast is that for me, it allows me to explore even wider or more subjects or wider ground my books definitely tackle a lot of topics, and I bring a lot of various viewpoints and ideas into the exploration of spirituality and healing. I'll reference or quote someone like Ram Dass in one chapter and then talk about Slayer in another. And the fact that I can do that to me is such a gift, like it's like, wow. And I can reference like these obscure bands that have meant so much to me in my life, and walk into a Barnes and Noble. Like I was just in the one around here in Connecticut, yesterday actually, and they had all three of my books, which often they usually only have the latest one out, but this one had the unholy trinity. I joked with my girlfriend, hey, it's the unholy trinity, but that was cool, and then I flip it open and I just I see the dedication to my family, and all of them are loved ones, and I'm able to give my respect and love to these people who have meant so much to me, teachers. And I don't know, it's just cool to know that if I die today, I mean, I don't want to die, but let's say some freak accident happens, it's really nice to know that between my podcast and writing and articles that something of me will be left behind that will hopefully continue to help others in their own lives and in their, I know I've said it, I don't mean to keep saying this, but their healing journey, for lack of better phrasing. That's kind of how I see it. But so lots of similarities, but also differences, and it's just a lot of gratitude around the entire thing.
I love that that you explore your eclectic influences and things that intrigue you. I think people expect writers, fiction writers to have, to always be kind of pursuing the vein that they are in. And to me, that makes for a very dull and boring person. People, we have such wide ranging interest, and I love to talk to people from all over the space. It's one reason I have such a broad range of guests on the show. We may have, someone that's writing nonfiction like you, and then tomorrow we may have a romance author, and then the next day we might have a thriller mystery, and then we might have a, sword and sorcery fantasy author.
I love that.
But it's because we're people. We love all sorts of things. And by taking in all of those eclectic influences, I think we can then create something that's new and fresh. And, we always talk about that new thing that stretches the boundaries of genre and things like, well, the only way you do that is by, reading and talking to people that don't look like you, don't sound like you, aren't into the same things as you. That's how we become broader people.
Absolutely. And again, that's why I love my podcast, is I get to talk to so many people I otherwise wouldn't, just like you get to do with your show. And yes, mine, it essentially does kind of have to fall under that umbrella of mental health, just like yours falls under the umbrella of writing. But still, like, those are such big umbrellas, so where you can talk to so many different styles of writers. I get to talk to, whether it's a writer or it could be a skateboarder in recovery, like you mentioned Christian Hosoi, who's a recovering addict, and or Henry Rollins, who might not specifically be spiritual per se, but he still has a lot of just incredible things to say, many of which still would fall under that umbrella of just well-being. And so I'm grateful that that's kind of the standard, I guess, I set for myself, and here I am 3 books deep now, so there's no going back, and I'm so glad about that, because if I just had to write about meditation and like spiritual this or spiritual that, like, I would be so bored. I would thank you.
And we don't need one more book of 10 points of how to be a more well-rounded individual.
Seriously, right?
We really don't need that book. What we need are these honest, gut-wrenching, stories of people that are sharing their personal experience, because that's where change happens, when we connect with someone on that deep level and see that Chris went through this and he made it. I can do this too. So tell me about Dead Set on Living. We talked a little bit earlier, but when did this kind of come together and you knew this was the book to write?
Yeah, so well, like I mentioned, that relapse that where I was intubated and at the end of my marriage. So it was shortly after that, really, I'd kind of been working on a book a little bit, but it fully took shape after that because here I was, 2 books out, with major publishers. I'd been speaking about addiction, recovery, well-being for years, and then I suffer a relapse that almost takes my life. So what I did with this book was, of course, the preface and the introduction were essentially about that experience and a little of what led me to write this book the way that I wrote it. But where it differs from my first 2 books is each chapter is a narrative conversation with, again, a very diverse group of individuals. So from spiritual teachers to addiction experts to neuroscientists to, eating disorder specialists, people of that nature, yoga teachers, hip-hop artists, writers, all people that are well known and respected in their fields, and people that, of course, have impacted me in my life, hence my wanting to talk to them in the first place. But so each chapter is a conversation essentially centered on the question, why, first and foremost, why do we engage in self-defeating behaviors? Secondly, if we've had time away from them, like in my case, for example, I had been in recovery for many years. Why do we go back to these self-defeating behaviors? And I want to be very clear. It's not a book that's just about substances. It's a book that covers the human experience, essentially. So, it could be drugs and alcohol, but also depression or video games or shopping or sex or eating or, any of the myriad things that human beings can use to access that negatively impact their lives. And that doesn't mean jail, but it essentially could be big stress that leads to health issues or, whatever the case may be, family relationships that aren't doing well because of certain behaviors or actions and things of that nature. But so each chapter explores these questions of why do we engage in these self-defeating behaviors, or why do we return to them if we know better? But ultimately, what can we do to stop from going back to these? How can we learn to start to really feel our feelings and sit with our feelings and embrace our humanness? And at the end of each chapter, there's a corresponding practice. So you might have a practice that's rooted in Buddhism, or then you might have a practice that's just a simple breathing technique or a writing journal prompt. There's so many different things, hand meditations, all sorts of stuff. And it's written in a way, I always write all of my books in a way that is very accessible to anyone who picks them up. Often I keep in the back of my mind while writing my 19-year-old self, because that's where I cross that line from abuse to addiction. And so I try to think of what might I have read that possibly, not definitely would have, but maybe if I read it at that time, it could have sent me down a different road. Or at the very least, could have potentially planted some seeds that later would come to fruition. And so that's why it's so important for me to write in a way that literally anybody could pick up the book and hopefully be able to connect with it. And that is what I see, Hank, in so much of the correspondence I get. Anyone here that's listening has been published by a traditional publisher, that when they're doing the marketing, they come up with target demographics and things of that nature. And my publisher did that. But there really is no target demographic for my books if we're to look at the responses I get, because the age ranges anywhere from like 13 or 14 up to people in their 80s. It's equal parts male and female. Doesn't matter if they're gay, straight, transgender. Doesn't matter what spirituality they do or don't believe in. And that is what means so much to me, is that shows me that what I'm setting out to do, I'm accomplishing, which is, offering this material in a way that is really accessible. And I'm so grateful for that, because that to me is how, at least for me, how I find I can connect with people, meeting them where they're at in a way that is in no way preachy. I say in all of my books or all my talks, I don't have the answers. The best I can do with you is share from my experience, and hope that some of that, or the experiences of others that I bring into my books, between myself and them, hopefully you're going to take away at least one, if not many more things that will help you as you're moving forward in your own life. So, what was the question again? No, something about the new book. I don't know, but hopefully I kind of answered it.
Well, I love that the book is couched in these conversations, because we, there's a whole subgenre out there of like rock star biographies where you can find some of the most salacious stories of debauchery and people that have just gone, taken addiction and abuse to professional levels. And you can read the stories and there's, they're like watching the train wreck and you just can't take your eyes off of it. Yeah. And there's probably some redeeming value to those stories in that this is a great example of what not to do. But how do you go about telling your story and, with very real graphic, gut-wrenching details without just allowing it to be one of those books? Is there always an eye toward how can I take my story and make this find some redemption in it?
Absolutely. I never share what I share in a way that is trying to glorify the darkness of what I experienced. I think there is something to be said for honoring that experience in my life, because that ultimately has been the great catalyst for change for me. So it's important for me to share that, again, in a way that's not glorifying it, but also I don't want to water it down either. So that, that's always tricky. And of course, like you mentioned, I love those books. I'm not going to lie. Like, I love reading the books on debauchery, and there's not really much in the way of like, so what do I do if I've experienced that? It's more just like, here's, the insanity of my life. And I love it because I can relate and I've been through it. Not to the extent many of these people have, because they had a lot more money and, things of that nature. But I love that stuff. However, for me, like I said, I really am lucky to be alive. And so it's important for me to share the reality of what I experienced and what so many others experience on a daily basis, but to do so in a way that part of it is just laying a foundation. It's just showing, look, here is what has happened to me. And if you are an abuser or even an experimenter of drugs and alcohol or other self-defeating behaviors, maybe you will end up in this place one day. I hope not, but here's the reality of where you could end up. Or maybe you have already been there, or worse. But what's most important is, whether you've gotten there or you haven't, or you've been through worse, there is a way to go more deeply into yourself and to live a life that has greater peace and contentment in it. I'm not saying a life that's always unicorns and rainbows, because there is no such thing, contrary to what a lot of other spiritual books might try to tell you. That's not the reality of life. But to me, it is very realistic to say the degree to which many of us experience suffering in our lives is much more in our control than we actually understand or recognize. And there are ways and means and methods, if we're willing to do a little legwork, start slow, start small, but put forth a little effort and start making little changes or incorporating little practices in our lives, that we really can live a more integrally healthy lifestyle. And so again, that comes back to why I share practices and teachings from so many different lineages, and whether spiritual, not spiritual, because there is no right answer for everyone. 2 + 2 does not equal 4 in every single case. Well, that's not a great example, but So yes, okay, 2 plus 2 is equals 4, but like what works for one person does not work for another. And so that's why it's just important for me to offer so many different viewpoints and teachings. But yes, it is tricky to toe the line there and balance that out. But that to me is very important, to be real about my experience, but to not glorify it. And I do a lot of work with the younger people. I do 3 workshops a month here in Connecticut with people ages 14 to 20, both male and female, and they're in this facility. It's a beautiful, beautiful mental health and healing facility, and they're there for substance abuse, for self-cutting, for depression, for suicide attempts. I mean, 14-year-olds that have already tried to commit suicide, and not just cries for help, but some are really sincere attempts. That is so utterly just gutting to me, but I can relate to that, and I understand that. So for me to pretend like I haven't experienced what I have experienced, that's not going to do them any good. But also by me just sitting there and basking in the darkness, that's also not going to do them any good. So I kind of qualify myself by sharing a little of my situation or what I've been through. Again, just kind of a nutshell version, but spending more or most of the time on, all right, so here's where we're at. What can we do to move forward? That's what matters most.
Well said. Well said. Chris, you are a fascinating guy. I've loved talking with you. Your writing is as well. The new book is called Dead Set on Living, Making the Difficult but Beautiful Journey from Effing Up to Waking Up. I'm going to put a link to it in the show notes and encourage everyone to go pick up a copy of this book. Chris, we mentioned your website earlier, but is that the best place for people to connect with you?
Yeah. Thank you for mentioning that. And it is. You can find me on any social media through there. It's all linked up. The books are there, or you can find them on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever. But yeah, any events, or if you want to message me, the contacts are there. It goes to my email. I do all this myself. I respond to all emails I get. Sometimes it's same day, sometimes it's a week, depending on what I have going on. But if you take the time to write, I'm grateful, and I will write back. Or if you have a question, I'll always get to it. So yeah, that can all be done at theindyspiritualist.com.
Excellent. Chris, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today and to share with us.
Yeah, well, thanks for your interest, and thanks for having me, and thank you for hosting this wonderful program and shining a light on the important work all the beautiful writers in this world are doing.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
Midnight struck. The Sandman had come. A few faint notes drifted through the rooms of 417 Gorybrook. The hollow wind testing the weatherproofing, the weak scritch of the persimmon tree against Zeph's window, and the drone of Hedwig's snoring. The old house shifted, creaked, and the shade of Agatha Van Brunt descended from the attic. "Brom?" she called. The ghost paused, collecting herself on the stair. She passed a mirror, but the glass remained empty, reflecting only absence. Agatha would not have recognized herself anyway. She had been beautiful long ago, and still was in her own mind. Not a toothless and wizened spectre. Not a blue chalk sketch of a hag half erased from the blackboard of night. She drifted into the master bedroom, disappeared into a shaft of moonbeams, and reappeared on the other side. She stood over Hedwig, listening to him snore. But Hedwig was not Brom. She needed Brom. She slipped through the floor into Zeph's bedroom. She stood over him for a long time, listening to the persimmon tree's weak coffin scratch on the window screen. Brom? No, this was not Brom her son. But she loved this boy. So much hidden potential. He reminded her of Dylan, her grandson. Dylan had slept in this room many, many times. But Dylan was dead, never to return. This boy, Zeph, was alive. So alive. Oh, would that he might remain so forever. Look at him. Who would consign such a handsome lad to the rot of death? Only a very cruel and blind God. Agatha brushed her spectral lips to Zeph's cheek. He stirred, scratched the spot, and rolled into his pillow. But Zeph was not Brahm. Where? Oh, Brahm is dead. She remembered now. Brahm is dead, and so are Hermanus, my husband, and Hans, my brother, and old Baltus Van Tassel, and Katrina, all dead. Only old Agatha remains, after a fashion, to trouble the world. Her sense of herself sharpened and returned to her. She searched the rooms for the Crane boy. She sensed him. Yes, here was the boy, sleeping fitfully, holding his animal. She extended a hand as if to reach into Jason's chest and take his heart in her talons. The dog woke, sensing Agatha's presence, and growled. Growl till your voice cracks, cur. I could kill this child myself. I could possess the man or the boy. I could take the butcher knife from the drawer. I could stride through the night in strong male form and dissect this child at my whim. Something struck her. Something blasted her up and away from the boy. She collected her energies again and tried to re-enter, but could not pass through the walls. When she found her voice, it came as hollow and cold as wind through a tomb. Who is here? Agatha whispered, and her tone might have withered grass. Show yourself. She waited with growing confusion and anxiety. She threw herself forward and battered the door like a tempest. Who is here? She cried. But no one answered.